Guys, welcome to Smokefest. We're from Super Butcher. We're going to be talking today about some Angus short ribs, and we're using a Wagyu brisket today. Now we're moving on to the big boy. I think brisket can be intimidating. It's a very large cut of meat. If you see it in the packet, I think this was about 10 kilos or 8 kilos. And a lot of people think, what am I going to do with that? So you can come into store and we can cut down portions for you. If you prefer the fatty point end, we can do that. If you want the leaner flat end, we can do that, because it's not very often you need to cook a whole brisket. You've got 4 or 5 people coming around, you need 1.5 kilos, 2 kilos. We can fix that for you. So with any big piece of meat like this, the first thing you want to do, you want to get it out. You probably can't resist to give it a slap. But if we're talking about barbecuing, and that's what we're here for, the top of your brisket I like to trim down to about a 10 mil or 5 mil thickness, because this will become the bottom of my brisket if I'm putting it into a smoker or anything like that. Mainly if you've got a heat source coming from directly below the brisket, because you want to protect that bottom as much as you can. So as we'll start at this point end. Any of this thick fat, and a good way to tell, so if you just kind of run your hand over it, you can feel when it's hard. When it's hard, there's a little bit of fat there. When it's a little bit softer, there's not as much. And again, you can always get us to do it. We love doing it for you.
So if you're cooking for, say, 10 people, Joel, how many kilos of brisket would you recommend? Because obviously, once you're cooking it for 12 hours, it's going to shrink a bit, won't it? Yeah,
look, I'm saying probably 2 to 3 kilos, depending on...
So about 300 grams a person?
Yeah. You're going to get a little bit of shrinkage out of it. And I find if it's the first time someone's had brisket, it's very Moorish. If you get it right, and someone's the first time they've had it, they'll just keep going back. They won't worry about the sides, the coleslaw, the buns. They don't want any of that. They want the brisket. So if it's the first time you're cooking brisket for someone, always allow for a little bit more, because they are just going to hoe into it. Great question. A lot of people keep the brisket offcut to mix it with some chuck or some other brisket and make burgers out of it. So if you've got a grinder at home, you can keep that aside, maybe bag it up in smaller amounts, mix it with a little bit of leaner meat, and it makes great burgers if you want to give it a coarse grind and make your burgers at home. You can render it down as well if you wanted to, and keep some tallow. But really depends how far you want to take it and whether or not you have those options at home to grind it down.
What's your ideal meat to fat ratio for a good burger?
70-30. So, I think if you're really talking about burgers, you want a bit of fat. That's where that flavour comes from. If you've got good fatty burgers, don't cook them inside. Take them outside, put them on the char, let that flare up happen. Because if you cook them inside in a fry pan, you're going to end up with a bunch of fat in the bottom of that fry pan, and you just don't get the best result for your burger either.
So if you've got about, say, 300 grams of fat left over from this brisket, you go to your butcher or your super butcher, if you're a really good shopper, and you mix it with about 700 grams of, say, lean chuck, or like Joel said, on your next brisket, take about 700 grams of just more the meaty part of it. So that way you got about 30% fat, 70% meat. Great burgers.
So you can see there, most of the fat's gone now. It's just a light layer on it. And now we're going to flip it over, and what was the bottom side will now be our top side. And I'm going to trim this back completely. I'm going to get rid of pretty much every single piece of fat. And again, the reason being is I want to really focus a lot of the rub on this bottom side. And much like the short rib, you'd be spritzing this throughout a cook, just keeping it moist. When I cook a brisket, I let it go for about the first hour 20 minutes, do its thing, and then about every 40 minutes I spritz after that. But everyone has their own way of doing it. We all just want nice, tender, juicy brisket at the end of the day.
What's your favourite way to reheat a brisket, Joel? Say you didn't nail it, so they didn't go for 7ths, they only went for 6ths. Yeah. And you got about 500 grams left.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, I've got a little vacuum sealer at home, so I cut it up already.
Yeah.
Vacuum seal it, so about 300-400 grams a bag.
Yeah.
And I used to have a sous vide at home, it broke, so now I just get I get boiling water, temper it down a little bit to around 80 degrees.
Yeah.
And then I just I drop the bag. This is already vacuum sealed into the water. Just let it come up to temperature.
Yeah.
Takes about half an hour for 500 gram thin slices.
Yeah, I never have leftover brisket, so if you want to
take
some notes today as well, you could probably not have leftover brisket too.
One day I'll be as good as you. One day.
Normally, brisket can be very rich, especially the Wagyu, which is what we're using today, and I'll tell you why we're using it today, other than us having a buttload to sell over there of it. I'll tell you why. But it's very rich, and I usually like to make a pie out of it and put the pie back in the freezer for another time. It's not something I eat every day. So what I'm doing now is a channel of fat that connects your point and your flat of your brisket. So this muscle here being your flat, you can see that kind of larger muscle on the bottom there, and then this one on the top being your point. So that would be essentially how I would trim a whole brisket, which then you could use a binder when you're rubbing your meat. On pork, I use a bit of mustard. On beef, I don't usually use a binder. It's quite wet anyway, and that just helps the rub stick to your meat a bit better. You don't want it just falling off as you're carrying it around, but you know, if you get a good coating like that, you'll see a lot of it just sticks to it. So that's the basics of a whole brisket, of trimming, prepping. You'd really want to make sure you get a little bit of that channel fat out because it takes a lot to render. But what I'm going to do now is talk about the point and the flat. So I'm going to remove this because they have two different uses for me. I'm just going to cut it straight through there. So that's the point of your brisket. If you can see, you'll see the marbling's very fine through it. There's very fine strands of marbling running through it. And if we kind of have a look at the point here, you can see it's much thicker. The fibers of the meat is a lot thicker. And like I said, they have two different uses. So before we go into that, one thing that's super important about any meat, not just brisket, is making sure you cut against the grain. And there's only one man I know that challenges that, and that's Guga Foods. He's great, but look, I'm going to stick with cutting against the grain. So with a lot of your roasts and any bigger pieces of meat, you want to make sure you cut against the grain. And what I do with brisket, because you can see here, this brisket is kind of running on a slight angle this way. So what I do with any roast or brisket when I start, is just on this tail piece, I put a little nick with my knife, and that just tells me the direction I will need to cut. So I'm cutting on a slight angle the whole way up to get the best of my brisket. I'm sure we've all been in a position where we've got the corned meat out or we've got the roast out and we've cut it and we thought that's not right, and we spin it around and we cut it again and we think, well, that's not right either, and you spin until you get that nice slice. It doesn't fall apart in shreds. So because we're going to rub this, we're not going to be able to tell what way the grain's running once it's cooked. So putting that little mark there just keeps you true and honest, because a lot of people would get it out and just start cutting it straight up that way. So I'm going to talk about this point for a little bit. I'm going to throw this over to Jaden, and he's going to give it a good coating of rub. So a lot of the time you'll find your point is where you get a lot of your sliced brisket from. If you're heading to any of the guys today, I think they're just slicing brisket, but it's the kind of long rectangular guys. It's very juicy and moist, but not quite as juicy as moist as this point is here. So I'll throw over to Jaden while I'm just trimming this guy up. He can tell you what he's doing there.
So we're giving a good coating of rub. And we're just going to keep
Step one
doing
to
that
no leftover brisket.
So earlier on the ribs, we used Lane's Barbecue Signature Rub. So it's a really good all-rounder. For beef, we're going a little bit more specific. So this is from Lane's Barbecue again. They've got two rubs that are both of our personal favorites, or mine at least. Joel seems to like everything. And one of them is Ancho Espresso. So that is a rub that's based on ancho chili powder. It's not hot, it's just enough so that you know that it's there. And then the other half of it is coffee grounds. So it doesn't taste like coffee. It gives it like an earthy, sort of umami sort of flavor. And it works really well in beef because it brings beef down to that level that you want it. It's not too sweet or anything like that. Then the other half of it is the brisket rub, which is the standard like salt, pepper, garlic, a couple of other little things added to it. So I think pretty much Joel bullied Brett into making this combo because he liked both of the rubs so much. And since, he's never had a leftover brisket, it must be pretty good.
In America, a lot of the teams would layer rubs to get different flavor profiles through your brisket. So being able to buy both the rubs in one container has really helped us along, being able to get those flavor combinations together. So while Jaden's finishing that up, I've now trimmed up this point extremely well. So I wouldn't normally trim it this much, but I really want to show you guys what it's about. So if I flip it over here, you can see that marbling just running across this way. And if you've watched barbecue on YouTube or whatever before, you would have heard of burnt ends. And that's where this cut comes from. You'll notice once I cut it, the marbling's a lot thicker that runs through it. So we want to render it more. People refer to it as beef marshmallows. And it's a pretty good term because that's the best way I can describe it. But as we cut this up here, so if you were to cook your brisket, I would separate the point from the flat, and I would dice this point up like this, and I'd mix it through a bit of barbecue sauce. If you like it sweet, you'd put a bit of brown sugar in there, maybe some butter, and you just glaze them and throw them back in the smoker for about half an hour to glaze them up. And as you can see, again, just the fat that runs through that is beautiful. So the aim is to render it as much as you can. These nice little bite-sized pieces, and there's no going back.
I mean, if you're here today, ladies and gentlemen, you know that fat is flavor.
Yeah.
Well, your Monday to Friday, you can avoid it a little bit, but if you want something that tastes good, you need a bit of fat in it.
I'm plenty flavoursome. So that's your burnt ends. You can also slice this. So as you saw before, this was sitting on top of the brisket. If you've watched maybe some of the guys carving up today over in the tent, you'll see they'll cut most of that flat one way, and then they'll spin their point around and they'll cut it the next way. And it's because majority of the point end of your brisket has your point on it. So they're gonna cut the majority of that piece against the grain, and where your flat is, they'll cut that against the grain. So you end up getting a whole bunch this way, and then the rest of it that way. But today we're doing burnt ends.
So just while Joel's finishing that up real quick, just to show you guys, so we've gone pretty heavy-handed on this. It was about a 10-kilo brisket to start off with. We're up to about here on the rub, so there's more than 2/3 left. If you buy 2 of these today, they're only $20 each. This one's brisket and ancho, this one's signature.
So that's that. One of the questions we got yesterday was how long does it take to cook a brisket? I have never cooked 2 briskets that have taken the same amount of time. They are a very unique piece of meat, and you've got to do it to temperature and feel. You're better off giving yourself more time to cook a brisket and wrapping it in a towel and putting it in an esky. It'll stay hot for 3 or 4 hours than underdoing it and having something that's a little bit tough. So always give yourself a little bit more time. I know it's hard waking up at 2 o'clock in the morning, but if you want a really good brisket, that's the goal. So I generally give myself about 12 hours. The quickest brisket I've cooked is 8 hours, and I didn't do anything different. It just cooked really well and was super tender at 8 hours. But it is a unique piece of meat that needs attention during its cooking time. I've also cooked a really, really bad brisket for about 12 hours. So
Had leftovers of that one, didn't you?
Yeah, you got me. So, you have to look after brisket while you're cooking. It's not an easy piece of meat. A lot of these guys will tell you that here today. It needs attention during the cooking process. I like to cook my brisket at about, again, 120 Celsius, 250 Fahrenheit. I find it's a really good middle ground. A lot of guys talk about wrapping. If you're happy with the crust or an internal temperature, about 150, 160 Fahrenheit is where I wrap at. I'm not too fussed on crust. I'm really just looking for a really tender brisket. So during the wrapping process, you might put a bit of sauce in there, put some butter on your brisket, wrap it in a couple layers of alfoil or butcher's paper, pitch paper, whatever you prefer. You want to take it to about 198 to 200 Fahrenheit. And at that point, it's not necessarily ready, but that's when I start probing my brisket just in the flat, in the point, and when it goes in like a hot knife in butter, that's when I know it's ready. So if you're not happy and it's not going in like butter, wrap it back up, take it 2 to 3 degrees could be all it needs. It's very, very minimal. So, don't be scared. Like I said, give yourself that bit of extra time and take that couple extra degrees.
It's one of those few rare cases where if it's tough, it's probably undercooked, not overcooked. If it's pulling apart instead of slicing, that's when you're getting to overcook, but it's still just as tasty.
So I wanted to show you guys, this is your flat, and compared to the point earlier, you can see how much finer that marbling is and how much finer that texture is compared to your point, what we were talking about. So you can see there, the marbling in the point is just a lot heavier and thicker strands of fat. All right, thanks guys. Thanks for coming down. Get yourself a feed and have a look around and keep enjoying Smokefest.